In December of 2013, an article was published in Nature Neuroscience that discussed a new study that was trying to figure out how memories can be passed down to later generations through genetic switches that allow offspring to inherit the experience of the ancestor. Scientists have long assumed that experiences were built up over a lifetime, but this new study suggests that fear could be passed down from our most ancient ancestors. This interesting information begs the question: how could our most ancient ancestors have implanted a thought system we might use today? Could there have been an event in the past that was so big, so terrifying, that it would have altered our DNA as a human species, and that experience would have forever changed the experience of what it means to be human? In 2005, Wallace Thornhill and Dave Talbot published the book Thunderbolts of the Gods. This book explained a new theory about our current universe. They attempted to intertwine the mythologies of the world with the forgotten science of cosmology. Here, they presented evidence of an electric universe, a universe that operated by different principles than are understood in our mainstream science today. They believed that this new theory explained the massive damage that happened to our ancient Earth and our solar system approximately 10,000 years ago. According to their work, this account is recorded in almost every ancient text around the world. They weren't just mythologies, they were real events. Could this theory explain an event so huge that it would have been ingrained in our DNA?
My work looks at the complete picture. What happened? How did all of this begin? What caused it to begin? What did the ancients say about the earlier period, which they called the Golden Age? What was that like? What was that all about? Some of those questions meant that there was something going on other than just gravity operating in the solar system. The electric universe says that, very simply, energy is a measure of the motion of matter in relation to all the rest of the matter in the universe. In other words, there is universal connectivity, which is quite different from the model at present that we're presented of the universe, of isolation by huge distances and by time. Cosmology has been described as the queen of the sciences. It is the intellectual umbrella under which all other sciences sit. Current Big Bang cosmology doesn't fulfill that requirement. It has no real connection to us as individuals on this planet.
But what about the connection between the mythologies on this planet and cosmology?
Our research reconstructs the history of the solar system. Virtually every culture around the globe preserved their own story of the dragon combat. So in Greece, it was Zeus fighting Typhon. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was Marduk fighting Tiamat. In the Rig Veda, it was Indra fighting Vritra. You can take these traditions and distill out the common thematic patterns in them and reconstruct the history behind them.
If there is a pattern to be dissected by science and mythology that tell a different story of how the universe operates, where do we begin? Wall believes we should start with the ancient recollection of an Earth bathed in a different light.
The most ancient recollections talk about the light being dim, rather purplish, and there being no seasons. So this meant the Earth's situation in the cosmos at that stage was quite different to what it is now, orbiting the sun. That took me decades to figure out. But having done it, it does require that we understand stars for the first time. And I say that because our present story of how stars function and what they actually are is based on a belief established in 1920 by Eddington, the astronomer, who felt that the only way to have a star shine for millions of years was for it to be powered by nuclear energy. Now, of course, we look at stars as being isolated objects in space, at vast distances from one another, being fueled internally, which is like the old campfire in the sky of the Aboriginals. It's just an updated version of that ancient story. But the truth is different. In modern times, when we discovered electricity, we found that we can generate the power some distance away. It can be hundreds or even thousands of miles away, and yet we can light a home with electric lights. It has not been considered that stars are connected electrically to the galaxy and that they trace the spiral arms of a galaxy like streetlights following the power lines. When you have that situation, you don't have to have nuclear energy lighting a star from inside. This paints a whole different picture of what a star is, and it also paints a whole different picture of what the various types of stars are, the red stars, the blue stars, the white dwarfs, and so on. They have to be then explained electrically, which is a whole different ballgame.
Wallace suggests this electrical understanding of stars might explain that Earth originally could have orbited a different star than our current sun. He was able to pinpoint that at one time the Earth might have orbited a red dwarf.
The ancients said that there was no seasons and there was no rain, but water misted out of the atmosphere almost continually. This is the ideal situation for the Carboniferous era giant plants, and they're found in the Antarctic and the Arctic, the remains of these things. The question was, how on earth did they grow there? Red stars are probably of such a low temperature, and their redness is actually responsible for this dim red light, that we were part of a red dwarf system which was captured by the sun. The idea that life is more likely to be found inside the red anode glow, as it's called, paints a different picture to the situation on Earth. When you're orbiting inside a glowing sphere, you receive the same energy over every square inch of the body. That means that the poles are at the same temperature as the equator, and it doesn't matter whether you're orbiting fast, upside down, on your side, whatever, you will still receive the same energy. So any other body in that same environment will feel the same. The question then arises, well, if we were a partner to a red dwarf, where is the red dwarf? Well, the answer to that electrically is easily answered too. On entry into the sun's environment, that electric light would switch off. Not only that, because it's at a lower voltage than the sun, it would turn into a comet.
The red dwarf deactivation could be explained simply by the difference of voltage between European and American appliances. American appliances run at 110, while European appliances run at 220. If you try to plug in a high voltage item into a standard line, it could fry your appliances, electrocute you, or cause a power outage. In the case of the red dwarf, the sun's voltage was much stronger, and therefore it caused a power outage in the red dwarf, which then caused it to lose its ability to electrically keep Earth and Mars orbiting its body.
And so the whole system, when it broke down, the red glowing layer would disappear. We would see the stars, and we would see the universe for the first time.
If this is true, could there be more documented evidence of a new sun witnessed around the globe?
One of the most important myths that we latched onto early on that has just been generally overlooked by other scholars is that the primeval sun is described in terms that are impossible to reconcile with the current sun. For example, the Mayan Bible's called the Popol Vuh, and in that document they will describe the origin of the first sun, and it says, when the sun first appeared, it was fixed in the sky like a mirror, and they specifically say that that sun is not the present sun. If that tradition was only found in Mesoamerica, you might overlook it. But we have now tracked down similar traditions in ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient India, like in the Rig Veda. They describe the sun as sitting as a stone in the middle of the sky, just like the Popol Vuh describes their sun. So clearly they're talking about a different sun than our current sun, because the current sun obviously does not sit still fixed in the middle of the sky. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, there's a very famous passage that says that the sun both rose and set over the same mountain, Mount Mashu. And obviously the current sun can't both rise and set over the same mountain. But in our theory, the sun was fixed in the sky over a world mountain. So it is certainly possible for it to rise and set from the same place. And so that's not just a tradition confined to the Gilgamesh epic, found already, let's say in 2000 BC. It's a very, very old tradition. It'll be found all around the world.
Could the current sun have electrically deactivated our first sun? If so, how would a new sun have affected life on planet Earth? And what would the ancients have witnessed?
One of the other aspects of being a satellite of a red dwarf is that red dwarfs, being an electrical object, have only one way of dealing with changes in their electrical environment. And that is to eject matter. They flare. And this is known. Astronomers have been absolutely amazed at the fury of some of these outbursts from red dwarfs. Now, in the case of our red dwarf star, it, in encountering the sun's environment, would have had to adjust suddenly to the sun's environment. In the process, it would have ejected material in large quantities. We can actually identify the possible bodies that were involved in all of this by the axial tilt, because each spinning planet acts like a gyro and doesn't like to be disturbed from its pointing to the fixed stars. This is why, gyros are used for navigation. Once you've got them spinning, they like to stay pointing to the same star in the sky. The Earth, with its tilt of 23.5 degrees, the next one is Mars, and the next one is Saturn. They're all within a degree or two of each other, which suggests very strongly that they were associated in this former system. Venus is the odd one out.
Wall believes that the amount of material ejected from Saturn as it deactivated would have been the size of Venus, and this is why it is the odd one out in the solar system.
In fact, piecing together the ancient evidence, that was the time when Venus was actually ejected from the interior of Saturn. Venus had no time to lock its rotation to that of its parent, and so when it was ejected, it was also given a slight backward kick, just like two gears meshing. And as a result, today, Venus is the only planet in the solar system which is rotating backwards. If you're an ancient person looking up at this sky, what you are seeing is a parade of planetary objects, which the ancients named, and also named them as gods. In other words, man felt totally powerless in the face of all of this activity that was going on in the sky.
Myths around the globe describe Venus as a comet-like object. And so you need to envision a gigantic planet close to the Earth with a miles-long tail spanning the solar system. And most people's compared it to a fire-breathing dragon. And it was terrifying to look at, and it certainly caused a lot of disasters, both in its immediate vicinity and raining towards the Earth. So it was a terrifying situation. And the planet Mars was involved in the same events. Mars was actually closer to the Earth at the time, but it's a smaller body than Venus. According to our theory, Mars and Venus participated in a very unique configuration that we call the polar configuration. And so as the Earthlings looked upwards to the North Pole, they would see first the planet Mars as a gigantic red orb, and then behind it they would see the planet Venus. And as Venus started spiraling out as a comet-like object, it appeared to be a dragon surrounding Mars. In the Egyptian text, for example, they will say that the eye of Horus raged around in the sky and created all these disasters. Raining fire, raining blood. Blood was throughout the land. And so they will specifically say that the eye of Horus, as Hathor, rained blood from the sky. Sumerian texts say the exact same thing about the planet Venus, known as Inanna. So Inanna, just like Hathor, rains blood from the sky. And the texts say that rivers flowed with blood. It was a spectacularly powerful disaster witnessed around the globe, and it went on for a prolonged period of time.
The prolonged period of time could have held the ancient people in fear and awe of what was happening in the sky. The Thunderbolt team believes that when Venus and Mars came close to Earth, they electrically interacted with the Earth's surface, sending meteorites and material from the surface of the planets to the surface of Earth. Venus would litter the Earth with these hot stones that would eventually cool and look green, while stones from Mars would have a red tint. The team believes that the idea of green associated with the heart and Venus originated from these interactions with the planets, as well as red stones associated with the war god Mars.
The myths both describe Venus throwing out this reddish material, but as time wore on, that material turned green. And so the myths in Egypt, for example, will have the eye of Horus then scattering green star-like efflux around the vicinity of Mars and the Earth. And so it goes from raining blood to raining these like turquoise stones. The qualities ascribed to the various gemstones and colors themselves will trace to these planetary events. So the planet Mars is always associated with iron, or the color red, and so red-colored gems traditionally will be associated with the planet Mars, like carnelian stone, for example. And turquoise will be associated with Venus 9 times out of 10. So in Greek lore, for example, you have Aphrodite that's associated with copper, greenish copper. Throughout Mesoamerica, here in America, the Maya and the Aztecs essentially worshiped turquoise stones, and they associated them with the planets and with objects thrown from the sky. And so they make that very specific in their rituals, that the reason they value these objects is because these are stones thrown from the sky.
Could these colors and symbols that we use today originate from this disaster in the sky? If so, what else did the ancients experience on a ground level that might be in some respects terrifying?
The electric universe paints a different picture to the solar system, and that is that electricity plays a role when the planets are not operating on stable orbits. Now, modern astronomy talks about the magnetosphere of the Earth. It is actually a plasmasphere, because plasma behaves almost in the fashion of a living organism, and it forms cell walls between an object embedded in the plasma and the plasma itself, the surrounding plasma. Now, in the solar system, of course, the Earth's magnetosphere sits in the solar wind, which is actually the solar plasma. And when these plasmaspheres, if you like, which are much larger than the planet, touch, the electrical connection is established between the two objects, be they planets or even asteroids or comets. When that happens, there is a direct connection then between the two bodies. But the plasma is such that it's very diffuse. Space has got very few particles per cubic meter. That means that when it discharges, it doesn't look like normal lightning. The ancients actually described this interplanetary lightning as like a coal spat from a fire, so that this object travels between the two bodies. It's known today from modern plasma physics that is called a plasmoid. It's a very compact form of energy transfer between two bodies. But when it approaches the Earth, that begins to disintegrate into colossal lightning bolts, the like of which we can hardly imagine. But it's enough to sculpt the Earth.
What would these colossal lightning bolts have looked like? And what kind of ancient imagery might depict this?
There were tremendous electromagnetic interactions between the respective planets. And so as terrestrial people looked up the polar column, they saw this giant cyclone-like object rotating around, causing disasters on the Earth. That was compared to a giant single leg in the sky, for example. And so our modern word hurricane comes from the Mesoamerican word hurricane, which was the name of their main god, their creator god. And he was described as having one leg. And that leg, or the god, supported heaven on his shoulders, kind of like the Greek Atlas. And so you get this image of this one-legged, gigantic, hurricane-like phenomenon that is just wreaking havoc in the northern circumpolar heavens.
We know that lightning, just the ordinary sparks of earthly lightning today, make loud noises, but the noises from these interplanetary thunderbolts were sufficient to break the sound barrier and actually make the Earth move almost as if it was a liquid and then freeze once the shock passed. So it created the strange formations like the triangular formations we see on the mountain ranges in the southwest of the US. The ancient witnesses actually saw these electrical events and they described the changes in the landscape at the same time. So we have good physical evidence for what the ancients were trying to tell us. The Grand Canyon looks like a minor tributary of that colossal scar. All of the features of the Grand Canyon can be reproduced in the laboratory by electric machining, electric arcing. And that is the stumpy tributaries with the very steep walls, the lack of any evidence of the outflow of all the material that must have been carved from that canyon, because in the electrical event, the material is shot into space. You forget gravity when electricity is in operation. Gravity is a puny force. It can excavate whole mountain ranges into space without any effort at all on its part.
How would the planets Venus and Mars have looked to the ancients during this interaction?
Venus was described as being brighter than 10,000 suns, which is the same phrase that was used to describe the first atomic explosions. The brilliance of the object being so close, and also with this cometary display, which is an electrical phenomenon as well, that bright cometary star-like appearance is actually an electrical discharge on the surface of the body that's approaching you. So the combination of electrical energy and the heat, because Venus was a new planet, but most of the activity took place between Venus and Mars. Mars was acting like a go-between between Venus and us. And so the god of war was so named Mars because he was the sort of intermediary, and he fought the demons, the monsters, which Venus had unleashed. In other words, this is material that had been shot into space and was now visible as separate comets.
If the ancients lived in fear of these gods carving their earth into pieces, how would this event have formed the basis for the floods recorded in ancient times?
Well, certainly it would disturb the rotation of both bodies, and the Earth's rotation would have been affected, and it would be fairly sudden. That sudden change in rotation would mean that the Earth's oceans would tend to slosh over the land, and so there's stories of great floods over lands. Of course, these stories are universal. The Australian Aborigines talk about the ocean passing over the northwest of the country into the centre of Australia, where we've got those great salt lakes where the ocean water dried out. So the other aspect, of course, would be intense earthquakes, because earthquakes also an electrical phenomenon, largely, like underground lightning. Even the Romans used to complain about the noise of the earth groaning, apparently. So there would have been colossal noise, the sound of these cosmic lightning bolts hitting the Earth, if they were very distant, sounded like giant trumpets. So you can get an idea where the archangel trumpeting came from.
If this is evidence of a life-changing event that happened because of an electrical encounter in our solar system, Could this explain the abundance of the creation myths?
In the creation myth in the Enuma Elish, Marduk, the warrior hero, fights against Tiamat, the great dragon. And the upshot of that battle is, after a tremendous struggle, Marduk slays Tiamat and takes her body and forms the organized world with it. So her body comes to form heaven and earth. She is split in two by the warrior hero. And each of those episodes will correspond to a real, reconstructible event in the history of the solar system. And so most people just pay attention to that particular myth. But the same exact myth is told all around the planet. So in the Rig Veda, for example, you have Indra splitting the dragon Vritra and forming the cosmos. The Old Testament refers to Yahweh destroying the dragon Leviathan.
If the myths of the world describe a mass destruction and a new sun that disturbed their current reality, how then did it shape the psyche around the event?
In the ancient myths describing the planet Venus as a fire-breathing dragon, such as the Egyptian myth of the Eye of Horus, Venus is certainly represented as a harbinger of destruction and a catastrophic agent, and raining fire from the sky, raining giant meteorites, bringing death and destruction, according to the Egyptian texts. So it stands to reason that the planet Venus would get a negative reputation in many of the ancient texts. And so a classic example of a negative Venus would be the Hindu Kali goddess, where she has a distended tongue and she has disheveled pitch black hair, and the hair is sweeping away the sun, causing eclipses, causing disasters. Kali is kind of like a global archetype of the terrible or negative goddess.
Could fear of the unpredictable heavens have caused the ancients to forget their original past and only remember creation from the moment of destruction?
They saw in the sky they thought was the creation of the home of the gods. And when you think about it, every ancient race on Earth has their creation myth, and the most ancient remembrances of what happened, these creations in the sky. It shows you that for any religion to think that it's talking about the beginning of the universe is mistaken. The creation myths are talking about the creation of the present-day system of the planets. And it was at the mercy of the planetary gods, because they were the ones that were creating this citadel in the sky.
If humankind stood in fear of this universe they were now indoctrined to, what would they do with this fear? And how has that original fear affected our thinking, our society, and our DNA?
Both Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung were aware of this problem for mankind. Carl Jung said our greatest danger is ourselves, because he understood man's symbols. And when you understand those symbols, it's strangely liberating. The biggest problem facing mankind is not remembering the past, and we have a desire not to know, he said. Instead, we live it vicariously by our doomsday movies, our occasional warfares, and we have this strange destructive behaviour both towards the planet and towards each other. It can only be addressed, I think, by understanding that ourselves. To achieve rationality, we must address this global post-traumatic stress disorder and understand the past.
In this series, we will dive deeper into the ancient past, where more evidence will be uncovered on each planetary body that suggests something destructive and something electric happened 10,000 years ago in our solar system. There are markings that our satellites have photographed of a massive event. There are ancient symbols that depict something strange in the sky, and there is science that rivals Einstein's theory. If there really is an electric universe, why is it not public knowledge? and who wanted to keep it a secret? The story of cosmology and the takeover of modern physics, next.